amazing co-organizer, wasn't able to join us today, but provided some really wonderful discussion questions that I'm hoping to share at the end of the opening statement sequence. And I'll be introducing our 4 invited speakers shortly. So welcome to the 3rd virtual seminar in our series of seminars as part of the CogSci workshop, How Does the Mind Discover Useful Abstractions? The focus of today's workshop is on language. We, as part of this workshop, organized 4 seminars, each focusing on a different cognitive domain, beginning with causal abstractions, then moving to perception and action, language and memory. Focus is on language, as I just mentioned. Here is what to expect. So over the next half an hour or so, we'll be hearing brief, approximately 5-minute opening statements from each of our speakers. There'll be a little bit of time at the end of each statement for quick clarifying questions. And then in the last half, ample time for discussion. I have a couple prepared questions, but there'll also be an opportunity for attendees here to ask questions of their own, either in the chat or by raising your hand, and I'll moderate that. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. First up will be Jacob Andreas, Associate Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Our second speaker will be Alex Carstensen, Assistant Professor of Psychology at the Arizona State University. Robert Hawkins, Assistant Professor of Psychology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And fourth, Elaine Suhr, Assistant Professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Sciences at UC Berkeley. Each opening statement should address these 2 questions. First, what concrete phenomena does a cognitive theory of abstraction need to explain? Okay. And second, what characterizes useful abstractions, in your view, in the domain of language? You can share your thoughts at perception and action if you like, but we especially want to hear about language in this one. All right, so without further ado, Jacob, the floor is yours. Can't yet hear you, I think because
I'm muted. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thank you, Judy, for the introduction. Super excited to be here. I work mostly on sort of natural language processing and machine learning tools for working with language data. So that is kind of the perspective from which this is going to be presented. And when I think about abstraction learning in the context of language and language understanding problems, this is sort of the fundamental thing that comes to mind, right? That when we present people, even with sort of new languages with very small data sets that look like little language learning problems, and we ask them to make predictions about how to translate or interpret the meaning or whatever of novel utterances, they often do so in a very consistent way. And so it feels like the fundamental thing that a theory of abstraction in the context of language learning or language use more generally needs to explain is why this happens and why it is that people generalize consistently and why we generalize, in the context of this problem in particular in this way and not some other way. And obviously there's an enormous body of work in linguistics and computational linguistics and computer science trying to explain this behavior in terms of specific computational processes that give rise to these kinds of translations, that we can talk about lexicons, we can talk about abstract composition rules for putting word meanings together and derive these kinds of predictions in this way. but I think, in some sense, this just begs the question that we had on the previous slide. There are many other composition rules that you could come up with to recover this particular prediction, or that you could derive from this particular data set that would make a different prediction here. And so why this one and not some other one? And we were told to talk briefly about how this relates to our own work. So I'll just show, we've been thinking about this a little bit in terms of ways in which you might arrive at the principle of compositionality, or arrive at specific compositional rules in various ways. And it turns out there are kind of task agnostic ways of doing it. And maybe even more surprisingly, when you take modern machine learning models, totally generic, nothing really specific to language in them at all, and train them on data sets requiring tests of linguistic generalization, eventually you do start to get human-like generalizations. And so some evidence that these principles might derive or be derivable from more general rules. The other thing that it feels like a sort of theory of abstraction needs to explain in the context of language use is how our linguistic abstractions, or how our abstractions sort of about the world in general that are expressed in language, actually relate to our ability to represent and reason about things in non-linguistic domains, right? So there's sort of famous body of work in cognitive science suggesting that the language faculty is implicated in our ability to build sort of domain general representations of compositional goals and compositional tasks. And this also feels like the sort of thing that a sort of general theory of abstraction ought to be able to talk about. So how is it that our ability to sort of label things abstractly with language, how does that interface with the kinds of reasoning that we do in other domains? And there's some work that we're doing in this area that I'll skip over in the interest of time. The very last thing that I want to say is that the way we are approaching this problem right now, at least in the sort of machine learning AI community, is totally backwards, right? You are, of course, all sort of aware of what's going on with large language models right now. And like the dominant paradigm for approaching new ML problems today is you train a big language model on all the language data that you can get your hands on. And then maybe you take that model that's been trained on a bunch of language and you specialize it to some downstream task, maybe linguistic, maybe not. And this works super well, but is also sort of crazy from the perspective of trying to understand things about how human intelligence works, right? In the sense that the sort of process that puts us in the state where we're able to learn and reason in human-like ways, that process has seen a whole lot of non-linguistic data and essentially no language at all. And so the other thing that I really want from a sort of general theory of abstraction here is an answer to this question: what are these sort of domain general learning problems that evolution saw, or that we're optimized to solve in general, in virtue of which we are able to do language learning and language representation in addition to everything else. And probably language will help us back out what this domain general or more general sequence of learning problems was. But fundamentally, the answer to that can't go through language learning itself. And if we could answer this question, then I think we would both be able to do sort of better ML in other domains, coming back to Judy's typo on the previous slide, and actually better answers to how we should do machine learning for language itself. And I will wrap up there.
Wonderful. Wow, that was like almost exactly 5 minutes. Thank you so much. Very, very exciting. Thank you again. Any burning clarification questions before we move on? Set that threshold high on purpose. Okay, Alex, take it away.
Just a second. Okay. Okay, I'm glad we talked a little bit about the more language specific stuff, because I tried to really dig deep and think about behavioral phenomenology that I'm ultimately trying to explain, which is a little bit weird as somebody who focuses on language. So this is just sort of a scattershot listing of things that I think are really important for understanding abstract thought. Broadly, I'm going to focus on cases where cognition sort of goes beyond the evidence, and I'm especially going to focus on more human unique cases, but that's not to say that I don't think there's any room for thinking about abstraction in non-human minds. I'm just going to focus on the stuff that I think would be really compelling for explaining human cognition. So first of all, generalization gradients. Lots of animals generalize, and generalization can certainly be driven by perceptual information. But why do we tend to round continuous experience into discrete categories in the ways that we do? So here's a little diagram of categorical perception, right, where the farmer has two chickens of two different kinds. One is fluffier than the other. But when he's really thinking about them, he's perceiving them as sort of more exaggerated into those categories. The fluffy chickens are really fluffy. The smooth chickens are much smoother. And that's a thing that people do for understanding sound categories, for color categories, for lots of other types of categories that they learn in the natural world. And I think that sort of rounding up and rounding down is strange, how we're carving up these continuous pieces of information into more categorical perception. And this happens not just for categories, but for scripts, for schemas, for other ways of doing conceptual organization. And I think that's important to understand. Next, symbols. So what are we doing right now, right? Like, why do we spend so much time and effort communicating symbolically and pictorially? This is something that we rarely see other animals do. They might communicate through sounds or through maybe one mode, but they don't tend to go around like drawing pictures and showing them to each other, which is something that we've been doing for a very long time and are quite committed to. So that's, I think, an interesting part of this to try to understand. Digging even deeper into the symbols, we can think of lots of what we're doing in language as symbolic in a really core way. And I want to point out that lots of animals communicate vocally or in other ways, but without the extreme level of complexity that we see in human languages. So why is it that we go around waggling our vocal tissues at each other for such great periods of time over the day? And how do we get such specific notions when we do that? So how do meaningless units of sound form together into meaningful symbols like words? We might focus on things like arbitrariness and duality of patterning, but I think there's a lot of phenomenology within language that's worth explaining here, including how we get from, rearranging dog into God and totally different conceptual sort of reference when we do that. Okay, higher order reasoning. So higher order reasoning can be difficult to define, but I would say even simple analogies and also a lot of math, science, and literature is focused on largely intangible ideas like DNA or intangible rules and principles like covalent bonds and golden ratios. And I think understanding how we come to think about that stuff, how we sort of transcend the things that we have perceptual access to in the world to think and talk about things that we don't have access to is a core part of this. Okay, I don't want to leave out social cognition. So theory of mind is just one example here of how we might track and predict expectations that differ from ours or differ from reality. And that seems like a key case of abstraction. Pointing is another one within social cognition. So why do humans so easily perceive this gesture as referential when other primates don't? And finally, timekeeping. I really like this example because it's so banal to us, but is really bizarre relative to the behavior of other animals, right? So how did we all manage to get here at almost exactly the same time, right? Like not just the same season of the year or the same general time of day, but within a few minutes of each other. This is not something we really see within self-organizing groups out in the natural world outside of humans. So why did we start doing this? Why do we care so much about it? How do we manage to do it? All of that. Okay, and what characterizes useful abstractions in language? So I would say from a human perspective, abstractions make language more learnable and more powerful. And there's a lot of examples of this, but in particular, I want to highlight word classes because it's a simple case. So they support inferences about novel words. If you know that you're learning a novel noun, you can look for something like shape in order to figure out what it attaches to in the world. Maybe it's shape, maybe it's material, maybe it's function, but there's sort of a set of relevant dimensions that you're going to look for. If you're learning a verb, you are going to look instead for something like dynamic event information. Another useful abstraction in language is the generality that words and things tend to map onto each other in one-to-one fashion. So this is a crucial part of why young children and even some non-human animals can like fast map novel nouns using exclusion learning, all of which requires sort of layers of abstraction and inference. Similarly, common alignment principles enable mapping from literal to sort of abstract uses of words. So this enables novel metaphors and analogies, which in turn can communicate both abstract and relational meanings and very complex ideas in a concise way. So I can say something like Romeo and Juliet is the same as West Side Story. And if you're familiar with either one of those things, that's going to convey a whole lot of information to you. Okay, from a more comparative cognition perspective, I think language is providing perceivable handles on categories. So I'll just give a quick example here. This is an illustration of a particular idea. It's not an obvious representation. So here's a second illustration of the same idea. The animation is not working on my end for it. But basically the sun goes through the sky a bunch of times here. And what I'm trying to communicate is the sense of 10. So we can think of 10 people and 10 days as the same type of thing, but that's not a very intuitive way to group two sets of things. And so I think this sort of grouping of things that are only very abstractly similar and otherwise superficially very different is something that language and the sort of symbolic handles on concepts that language gives us can help us do. And I think that's a key part of understanding how language is scaffolding cognition in abstract areas of thought. And that's it.
Amazing. Terrific. Thank you so much. Really, really thought-provoking. If there are any questions, don't be shy. But also I know that I made it sound really like you needed to have a really, really burning question. Okay, I think we're gonna have a lot of time for discussion in the hour, so let's keep going. Robert, the floor is yours.
Hi. So I'm going to start with a task that I found really kind of useful for my own thinking about abstraction and like the kind of phenomena that we might want to capture. So this is a collaborative assembly task. We pair people up and one of them has a scene that they're trying to get the other person to build. That's the person on the left, the architect. The person on the right is the only one with access to actually place blocks. So they have to communicate to solve this task. And basically the architect gives instructions. So we find some interesting things here when we look at the language people produce to do this task. And most notably, it changes over time. So the first time people have to do this together, they might say something like, you know, place 2 blocks horizontally, place a vertical one, place a horizontal one.
Robert,
so these are all kind of...
Sorry, would you mind zooming in a bit? It may be a little bit hard for
I think you're sharing the wrong window.
No. Okay, sorry. Let me thank you for stopping me. Oh, I have to do this first. Sorry. You would have thought that I would have figured this out by now, but now I think I can. No, that's the wrong one. Oh my God. So I'm using my entire time block to figure out how to share the screen. That's good. Okay, how about that?
yes.
Yes.
Those look like
Okay. So this is the less tiny version of the first thing. The second thing I was trying to show you is just people start out using words like this, but after just a few trials building scenes like this, they start using these kind of things you might think of as more abstract, like a long C or a long L or an upside down U. So these are kind of moving up levels of abstraction. And I think that this raises a bunch of questions about like what is going on in people's minds. So what concrete phenomena? I think the first thing, and this is very, I think, similar to something that Jacob said, abstractions are extremely task dependent. So we have a lot of ad hoc abstractions. And I think that we need to understand why certain abstractions arise rather than other ones. So, you know, there's a bunch of possible abstractions that could be in our space, and they're not all equally attested in a given task environment. Second, and maybe this is kind of a more provocative kind of argument, but I think that it's really key when we're trying to understand the functional constraints that give rise to abstractions. I think we often think about things like the now or never bottleneck, so like memory constraints or attentional constraints kind of force us to compress and abstract. But I think that another thing that is often overlooked is the social nature of our abstractions, that a lot of the ways that we represent the world in abstract ways, and especially in our language, come from the bottleneck of communication with other people. And finally, I think a really important phenomena is the ability of abstractions to not just exist in our heads, but to become durable and externally realized in a way that supports cultural accumulation. And then here's just kind of a list of, I think, important properties that is like a little micro taxonomy of things that make abstractions useful. So in language, an important property is that abstractions are what you might call first order objects. So they don't just like hover like phantom-like over our cognition like epiphenomenally. They're like tangible things that we can build together and decompose into parts and kind of play with in various ways. They're generalizable. So this is also something that Jacob shouted out, is that and Alex pointed out with the kind of analogical reasoning, you can use an abstraction from one setting in another setting. So you can kind of carry it with you. They're highly compressible. So abstractions, useful abstractions kind of allow the same information to be represented in a more efficient form. Abstractions are conventional, so they have to be aligned to be useful. So we can't just all have like our own linguistic abstractions. They kind of have to match up. So that's another kind of important constraint. And then finally, what might seem like the flip is that we ultimately have to ground a theory of abstractions in meanings that are inside individual people's heads. And I think that that is an important part of characterizing like why we, like medical professionals have one set of abstractions and, machine learning researchers have another set of abstractions, that they're related to the kind of individual concepts that are relevant within those communities, and those vary across the population. So just as a closing thing, and I think that I've gone over, but I can't tell whether it's because of my screen. I think one thing that I'm trying to figure out is how people do stuff like this. So these are these really abstract shapes, so you can get people to label them and they look like things to people. So they'll describe them in a certain way. And not only can they describe them in a certain way, they can actually like decompose them and say what the parts of them are, right? In a way that will allow another person to like map those parts onto the same into the same representation. So I feel like this is like the thing that I would like to be able to explain.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Robert. Our fourth speaker, Elaine, take it away.
Okay, thank you. So as I'm setting this up, my research area is generally in building language using systems, but I'm going to be talking at a very abstract level here in line with the theme of the workshop, and then maybe talk, can you hear me? Can you see things? Okay. Okay, so this is just one perspective, maybe my perspective on language and interaction that sort of informs how I think about building these systems. So I think about language as the set of actions that we take to recruit other minds towards our goals, in contrast to actions that we take in order to accomplish some goal like, oh, I'm thirsty, or I want some caffeine, so I'm going to take a sip of my coffee, right? So successful use of language in this way requires modeling our interlocutors, specifically how they might act on or understand the language that we produce, that they encounter. And this in turn requires taking into account interaction context, which includes both what we and our interlocutor might know, perceive in the world around us, intend, and even model like recursively about one another. So in this sort of from this perspective, what is a linguistic abstraction? So I propose that like what affords communicative efficiency, and of course this is a long history of being studied in CogSci, psychology, et cetera, are the existence of common linguistic abstractions whose use by one participant is modeled by the other. So if I start talking to someone, I can assume that they have this, maybe they have the same set of linguistic abstractions that I do, maybe they don't, and that's going to change how I use language with them. So some examples of linguistic abstractions that obviously have been very widely studied would be things like concept representations, how different parts of an utterance might be tied to the context. So when I refer to like, coffee, maybe I'm referring specifically to this thing, or maybe I'm referring to coffee in general. Syntactic processes that are these rules that describe how certain compositions of parts of utterances give rise to compositional meaning. And then there's just, I think, an infinite possible set of abstractions that languages can encode, not necessarily universal, obviously. You can have low-level abstractions, things like prosody that indicate things like whether you're asking a question or something like that, to higher-level features like evidentiality, honorifics, et cetera, things that don't necessarily exist in all languages, but are abstractions nonetheless. So one thing this is something that I'm not sure I 100% agree with, but I want to propose it as something that I've been thinking about as why these abstractions sort of exist. Obviously they weren't designed for this, but this is sort of maybe one of their functions is as predictable elements of utterances. So sort of scaffolding on top of which communication can occur. So if I'm generating an utterance, I can reasonably assume that parts of that utterance are predictable by my interlocutor because we share linguistic abstractions. Now, if every single feature, every use of an abstraction of my utterance were entirely predictable by my listener, there'd be no reason for me to actually produce this utterance. So what that means is that during language production, I'm constantly encoding unpredictability in the abstractions that I use. So at least some element, some feature of my language use is like a new abstraction or a misuse of an existing abstraction, so that I am actually communicating something to the extent that I actually believe that my interlocutor has some uncertainty about what I might say to them. So to answer this question of what makes a good linguistic abstraction, I'm just going to throw a few things on this slide. So like abstractions that we use in other tasks, like when we represent and interact with our environment, these abstractions should have value in reuse across a variety of contexts, and they should be cognitively plausible. But I think there's a few things that make linguistic abstractions unique compared to these other kinds of abstractions, particularly because they serve as communicative tools. So which means that they need to be part of this common ground between participants in an interaction. So some of the things that come through here are that existing abstractions that we learn when we're acquiring language are the products of millennia, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of natural language change through interaction. So they don't just come through me interacting with the world individually, they come from this really rich and very dynamic and nuanced history of just language changing over time. Now, when I want to propose a new abstraction, this abstraction should be understandable in the context of its use by scaffolding on top of these existing common ground abstractions. So if I just sort of say some random stuff, random sounds, and I intend to say something, I don't think people will necessarily understand what I'm saying unless I scaffold it in either existing abstractions that are linguistic abstractions or in the world around me, in the common ground. Another aspect of these linguistic abstractions is that they should be ready for use in interactions between arbitrary members of a language community. So if I grab someone random who speaks English, I can reasonably assume that we have the same sort of linguistic abstractions. So these abstractions should have the property that they can be broadly distributed within a language community. Another interesting thing I want to note that comes through with language in particular is that these abstractions can also serve as like a resource for negotiating power dynamics in a community. So who gets to define and enforce the use of a linguistic abstraction sort of gives us this scaffolding. So whose concept representations and abstractions are we using as scaffolding in order to change and use language? So I think that's also something interesting to think about. Okay, so what might a theory of abstraction explain? These are some things that I've been interested in with then applications in actually building language using systems. So things like how do conventions emerge and change through use? How do we build and use common ground of with our interlocutors? How do we represent concepts and knowledge? How does this tie to the other modalities like perception and action? And then how do children acquire language through interaction? So when we're thinking about building language using agents, we can sort of use these abstractions to answer these questions as well. So how can these systems use and make use of and propose conventions in interactions with humans? How can they reason about their human interlocutors in order to build common ground? How might they represent concepts and knowledge, tie this to their perception? And how might they acquire language through naturalistic interactions with humans by taking advantage of the kind of feedback that we will naturally provide in interaction? So I want to just point out to one particular thing that I've done, which is the serial bar environment. It's this 2-player game where you have to use language to coordinate. And we've studied a few of these questions through this sort of platform, like convention formation and learning through human agent interaction. Okay, that's all.
Amazing. Thank you, Elaine. And thank you to all of our invited speakers for those really compelling opening statements. So now we're going to move on to a broader discussion, looking for points of convergence and also divergence across the perspectives that have been presented so far. I'll start off with a question for you all, and then anyone, please feel free to raise your hand or begin typing a question in the chat if you'd like to ask a question for our speakers. So something that I heard in all 4 of your statements is a perspective on language, not as like a static object or an artifact, but like a tool that supports behavior in the world, especially social behaviors, including communication and coordination, that somehow like there's a gap that like acts of speech aim to bridge, otherwise there'd be no point in talking at all. And so in some ways, you know, what I was hearing from all of your statements is that there are certain linguistic abstractions that emerge to address a shared problem, but also each of you pointed out ways in which what people choose to say may depend on the situation they're in, that different people, even the same situation, may say different things. How do you think about the role of that kind of behavioral variation and like how you might model or build theories of it? Is it noise, you know, at one extreme, or is there some really, you know, other principles that we can use to try to really make sense of the specific forms of variability that we actually observe in language use?
I can
Anyone?
start on that, just to throw something out there to kick it off. So I think that like variability is part of the computational problem faced by speakers. So I think that this is like, it's not just us as researchers trying to deal with variability, it's a fundamental like computational like obstacle that must be overcome in communication. So it's like everyone I talk to is going to have slightly different representations because they have unique histories moving through the world. And that's like why I would argue that coordination that's the only reason we would need to coordinate or adapt or align, is if there were enough sources of variability that like we're not already all on the same page to start with.
So I think I heard this interesting perspective, and someone was supposed to give me a citation, so I don't have one, but that actually this variation and sort of miscommunication is actually a social tool that like helps build social bonds. So if you're sort of miscommunicating and then you have some discussion about how to come to convergence, that's actually a functional like interaction towards like building a group together. So that actually is like not just coming through from different experiences in the world, but it actually serves to function towards like, I don't know, community building, for example.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight one of the other sort of functions of variability, right? It's a driver of change to the extent that language has to change in order to match human innovation and changes in the world and changes across different contexts. Variability provides like a very natural mechanism for that, right? So we can adopt the abstractions that are a little bit closer to what's been useful recently, and that's going to propel cultural innovation as well, in addition to language change.
Right, and I guess maybe just to build on that, right, there's variability both in, you know, sort of use in a particular context and just in the whatever sequence of experiences, observations that a learner has access to that bring them into a particular state, right? And so some large part of I guess what's both kind of miraculous about the kinds of abstractions that we see in language is that we all wind up with, roughly the same boundaries around the same kinds of concepts, even though as soon as you ask people to actually delineate what those boundaries are, it's sort of impossible to do that precisely. So, right, I mean, I think, and from this perspective, thinking about it as a probabilistic process or something that looks like probabilistic inference, is helpful in as much as it sort of provides a framework for thinking about where that variability might arise and how one might resolve the differences or reason about the other kinds of things that other people might have learned.
Cool. Wai Keen?
Yeah, great. I just wanted to follow up on this question about variability and ask sort of like how you sort of see sort of like just like two aspects of language as a sort of form of abstraction that feels different to some of the other seminars we've covered. One is that language is sort of like explicit. You have explicit symbols to refer to things rather than sort of like implicit representations or implicit abstractions. And maybe the second one is this sort of like discreteness to it as well. Maybe they're like the same thing. And I'm just wondering from the perspective of like, is that helpful for like error correction or things like that if you're sort of conveying uncertainty, or if there's uncertainty in what you're saying, like some of the discreteness properties of language sort of help hone in on like the intended meaning or things like that.
Yeah, I think the explicit symbols and the discreteness give us a target, right? And what we're trying to achieve in communication is good enough coordination. We wouldn't want it to be perfect because then it would be very hard to change things and introduce new approaches. But we just need it to be good enough that there's a little bit of variation, right? You can think about it as very analogous to evolution through genetics, right? You don't want like huge changes happening, but if you have a little bit of change all the time, then that's going to help you invent new and useful things and modify things to be a little bit more efficient and a little bit better, as long as you're still close enough to the previous thing that you have sort of continuous, unbroken understanding.
Maybe another piece of this is right that there's sort of a chicken and egg problem here in the sense that, sort of understanding how language works requires understanding that, when I say a word like chicken, there's some like abstract set or there's some set of concrete entities in the world which may or may not actually all have particular features in common about which this particular word can be predicated, and once you sort of realize that that's the way language works, and once you realize that the kind of language is built from nothing but these kinds of abstractions, it invites you to start looking for those kinds of abstractions, those kinds of generalizations, and probably shapes the kinds of things that you look for even in when you were then inventing abstractions of your own, and maybe even prior to giving them names, and that maybe feels like the most important aspect of discreteness, or the thing that feels most important to get a handle on is that it not only whether you think of that as a sort of property of necessity, right, that we have to talk through this noisy communication channel, discretizing things helps you deal with the noise, or whether you think of that as something, sort of fundamental to what it means to communicate in the first place, wherever that discreteness comes from, it then has kind of wide-ranging effects on the other kinds of, or your propensity to categorize even more generally, and even outside of language.
So one thing that might be relevant that the actual word chicken reminded me that I didn't get to say specifically was that with language, you have this like immense flexibility in how you apply the words to the things that you perceive. So chicken in particular, I was having a discussion with a friend this weekend about how funny it is to just like call random birds chickens. And we all understand what it means. And we all kind of maybe, I mean, at least she and I both thought it was funny for the same reason. I can't exactly explain why, but like, sort of taking that discreteness and then sort of misusing it in that way is generating meaning. And I wonder if that has something to do with this as well. It's like this sort of infinite flexibility that maybe the discreteness is affording. I'm not so sure, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that like just riffing on a couple aspects of that, I think one is like, what kind of objects are the abstractions that words map to is like a really fundamental question in like philosophy of language. And broadly, so like the idea that it's like a collection of the chickens in the world that it's like truth conditionally like applies to is kind of like an extension. And then there's this other kind of way that formal semantics has been formulated in terms of like intentions, which is like rather than like bundles of possible worlds or something, it's kind of like a more like fundamental object that is like an evaluator that contains the notion of chickenness in some sense. And I guess like both of those feel like they encompass abstractions. Like if I have a neural net that I can run and it like gives a score for every single thing, whether it's a chicken or not, right? That feels like it's still representing some abstract, like, you know, abstraction of a chicken. But it also feels like the idea of like having an intention that like there may be like different representational affordances of that. And I kind of wonder, it feels like, yeah, like language in principle could bind to either one of those kinds of representations.
And just interject one really quick empirical point. So when I've asked people like for prepositions, right, which seems like a really dry area of language, about the sort of intension, the focal cases and the extension, what technically counts as on, even if it's not a good example of on, people are really in strong agreement about the focal cases. And there is massive disagreement about the boundaries. And I think that might point to a broader idea that concepts are a little bit idiosyncratic in terms of their extension, whereas these labels help us really coordinate on intentions, which is what we're using a lot of the time when we're communicating in fairly shorthand linguistic ways.
That's really helpful. I think this is pulling on a related thread, something really curious to hear your thoughts. I'd be remiss in a discussion, language and cognition, to not ask you all to share what you think is special about language, okay? In comparison to other kinds of symbolic artifacts that we use in order to communicate and think. For example, you know, Alex, you provided in your statement some examples of certain kinds of signs or icons or graphics that we can use to communicate meaning that may end up pointing to the same underlying mental representation for the concept of what time it is, what time we should show up at something. And yet you can point to that underlying representation using different kinds of tokens, more or less discrete. I'd be curious to just hear your thoughts about, you know, when it comes to drawings and gestures and tally marks and like what makes words special?
So one, you know, I think in all of the sort of opening statements and all the conversations that we've been having here, we're talking about abstractions in language, both in the sense of, you know, words, concepts, whatever, that refer to abstract categories of things in the outside world, but also abstractions in the language to refer to abstract properties of linguistic behavior itself, right? So, you know, chicken is an abstraction, but also direct object is an abstraction, or subject position and things like that. And one of the things that feels special about language, right, is the fact that you have these two kind of systems of abstraction interacting with each other. You have on one hand this relatively simple formal system for stringing phonemes, morphemes, words together. And on the other hand, a relatively simple way of relating these kind of formal structures that you're building up to things that are out in the world in a way that then allows you to describe what are ultimately really complicated phenomena in the world outside of language. And so what feels like maybe the special thing about language there is that we have somehow built some system of abstractions that are about language, and we can use these to communicate abstractions that are about everything else.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Like if we think about form meaning mappings, it's like everything is two-sided or like dual in some sense, where it's like we have, you know, like constructions that are purely operating on the form level, but that you can maybe think of them as like an interface to the meaning level. So it feels kind of like, this is also what I was thinking in response to Wai Keen, kind of reflecting on the other sessions. And it feels like there's something funny about language where it actually kind of like, not to be like a language chauvinist or something, but it like sounds bad, but it kind of like encompasses many of these other domains where like you can talk about like the linguistic abstractions corresponding to causal like structures, for example, right? Like we have like a lot of language for mapping on to different causal things or communicating causal notions and causal, I don't know, like events and things. We have, you know, like it clearly accesses memory in some form where it's like, you know, it's like an interface to memory, or like I can evoke an event or something with language at like a very high level of abstraction, or like evoke a schema. And like, it's clearly like all referential stuff, and like the kind of Elaine, yeah, I think Elaine's like way of stating the interface between people is like the way that I can like intervene on other people's states, right? It's like language is an action that's like targeted at manipulating, in some sense, like parts of the world that I can't otherwise have causal control over. Like that's also like embedded in a perception action loop. So I don't know, it's not, I think that like asking what's special about language insofar as like the affordances of linguistic abstractions is kind of that it's like maybe an interface into all of these other kinds of like forms of abstraction. I don't know. Highly speculative.
I'll just say for the record, I don't think language is special, is my guess. That I think language is a lot like other symbols, and you can often accomplish the things that you do with language through alternative means. I think the way, practically speaking, in which language is really useful is more about volume. Right, there's just a lot of it. It's very observable. That makes it easier to coordinate on. It makes it easier to use. It's compressible. So like it just has a lot of very practical uses. And we could do the same thing with, you know, sets of symbols that work differently from language. And if we had, you know, the same expressibility, the same volume, we'd probably start to call those symbol systems language, and then we get into a bit of a definitional problem. But I think broadly, when you look at things like the comparative literature on same and different, right? So higher order same and different, saying that two matched things are same and two mismatched things are also same, right? Like these shoes don't match, those shoes don't match. That's a higher order match in that it's the same relation, different in both cases. That's the sort of thing that non-human animals can do, whether or not they have a symbol for same and different. They can do it a whole lot faster if they have that symbol. And that symbol doesn't have to be a linguistic symbol. It can be a symbol that's trained like a button press, or it's something that you can get through in like sort of continuous training, but then it's like tens of thousands of training trials. And so that's what I mean when I say handles on cognition. I think language is helping us accomplish stuff that we could do otherwise in a way that's just a lot faster than we would be doing it. And we would lose interest if we had to do the tens of thousands of training trials in order to get same and different, if we hadn't already been sort of practicing up to it as toddlers, just hearing people say these words and trying to understand them.
Yeah, echoing all of this, I mean, I think also there's a certain amount of arbitrariness and like compositionality that like maybe we say language has that other forms of communication don't. I personally find, I feel like everything that I talked about in my statement was maybe general enough to not just apply to like what we might consider language. And I think that's okay. I think that all communication is like super intriguing to me. Maybe I'll be a bit provocative and say, pointing to my question of who gets to define words, like what is the function of having a distinction of language versus non-language? There might be an answer, I don't know, but I'm just putting that out there.
Yeah, maybe we should just talk about mediums of communication, because like I feel like a lot of what, I don't know, like a lot of what seems like unique about these kinds of abstractions is the way that like a medium of communication develops its own abstractions, right? Where it's like not just unitary things, but like within the medium of communication, there's like structure that is, yeah, like has higher order meaning. I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to try to thank you all for offering progressively spicier takes on these prompts. So you know, I'm curious to you know, take this idea that there may be something really, some kind of generic function that language serves, but maybe other media for communication, you know, could also like other media could also play those same functions, but maybe for whatever reason, humans end up finding it, you know, like easier to use words to perform certain functions. So when we're thinking about, let's say, building computational theories or models that in which useful abstractions emerge, I wonder how you think about, you know, how good cognitive theories of abstraction, theories of human-like abstraction discovery help us relate different prominent proposals about how to model language, structure language. Either the current generation of large language models or generative symbolic models, and to what degree they end up, you know, exemplifying or taking advantage of the unique features of language as such, okay? Or, you know, to what degree those same, you know, principles and ideas and those same architectures could be directed at very different kinds of data and discover the very same abstractions. Maybe to be more concrete, you know, you can use transformers to model structure in visual inputs. You can use it to model structure in tokens of language. And, you know, what is the difference between the kind of abstractions that we might uncover in either case?
So I think maybe some of the things I mentioned sort of point at this a little bit about like these like sort of intrinsic properties of language that maybe exist or that I'm proposing exist, about like basically, you know, we have this action and we're intervening when we're producing language to cause some change in the world, given some either like conscious or maybe even unconscious intent. And I mean, you can talk about whether or not these large models to some extent encode some kind of intent because the data they're trained on had some latent intent in it or whatever. But I think there's also this property that when we're constructing an utterance, we're scaffolding on top of predictable elements and then sort of manipulating parts in order to do the communication. And that is inherently unpredictable to our interlocutor. I think that's something, I don't know, I want to push on that like maybe a little bit more in thinking about the models that we're building and using, because I think it's kind of special. I don't know, but yeah.
I mean, maybe to Alex's earlier point on language not being special, right? There's, you know, when we, I guess, think about building computational models of intelligence generally, right? This sort of requires understanding how the world works. The world is a highly structured place. Some of the structure comes from the laws of physics. Some of the structure comes from, you know, sort of basic properties of how biology works on Earth. Some of the structure comes from human culture, and some of the structure that results from human culture results from probably things that are there as a result of human language use. But most of that structure, or at least a large part of the structure that's even relevant to the kind of decision making that we do in our day-to-day lives, is there for reasons that exist prior to language. So when we, you know, if we're building computational models for the sake of doing things that are useful and being able to interface with other intelligent agents, language is wonderful, right? It is, as everyone's been saying, the most sort of easily accessible, like externalized description of the internal abstractions that we think are useful for reasoning about the world. If our goal is to understand something about language itself and why language looks the way it does and where it comes from, it would be much nicer if we could sort of give an answer to that question that doesn't require the corpus, or at least a corpus of the size that we use for training the kinds of computational models that work well today.
Yeah, I totally agree with both of those points, and I think that maybe another important, I don't know, feature of, I don't know, like computational explanations is the functional perspective that they provide, which is that they provide a rigorous, precise specification of a series of functional objectives that govern which things emerge. And I think that like it seems pretty, I mean, like I think that like understanding this interface as like the reason why, like the communicative problem is what gives rise to the specifically linguistic things. Like we'd probably have like, if we weren't communicating, if we were just like solo agents, and we were the only human on Earth or whatever, like we would still have all these other abstractions, right? Like we would still have like, because the world is structured, you know, and it helps us plan and it helps us do all these internal things, but like we wouldn't have linguistic conventions, right? And we certainly wouldn't have like direct objects and things, right? Like, so I feel like that kind of way of understanding like the things that are specific to language seem to me to be things that are specific to the social problem of human communication.
All right, Wai Keen, last question is yours.
Great. I'll try and on a sort of big picture question. So one thing that's been on my mind when as sort of organizing this is something like the question of like, where do new abstractions like come from? Like, how is it that we sort of generate new and useful ones? And sort of as a bit more context for this, I've been reading a book on like the history of like the number 0. And if you sort of like look at a concept like 0, it took something like decades or centuries to really sort of like hone and refine. And just if we're thinking about sort of like AI and sort of you know, more intelligent machines, if they come up with new concepts, would they sort of be forced to undergo the sort of same sort of like cultural sort of conventions or sort of refining in concepts like similar like to how we currently do so? Or, you know, would there be principles to sort of like hone in at the right concept like right away, or the right abstraction?
This is a tough one because people have, you know, different learning mechanisms, right? So if you look at like the Olympics, right, you'll see that people get really slowly better because they're on this like sort of continuous improvement process over the years. The records go a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. But then in some sports, there are strategy differences that'll get introduced where suddenly, you know, the high jump is a foot higher and everybody is doing this now. And those are like two different like motor learning studies, those as very different mechanisms that are instantiated different ways. And one relies on a much more like explicit strategic approach and the other is much more continuous. And I think language is supported by both types of those, right? But the more implicit and the explicit. I would say that, you know, we're constantly having to resolve those sort of small mismatches all the time, right? When you're talking to someone and they're using a word a little bit differently, you have to try to understand them by tailoring your concept to at least adjust for their difference in it. It's the qualitative stuff, the like, you know, strategic differences that's harder, right? When we're like, okay, 0, this really changes the whole number game. How are we going to conceptualize this? And that's trickier because we don't have a great understanding even of how we come to get to those sorts of things, right? Like, is it the case that we essentially need a ton of pre-training on like related generalization problems that we're then exercising when we get these new conceptual understandings? Or are there places where we can really just do the like, you know, tens of thousands of training trials and like get there, just, you know, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps with a lot of time and effort? So I'm going to punt on the AI piece of this question because I think we don't have a clear understanding of how humans are doing this sort of thing and how other creatures are doing it. But there have to be two different sets of mechanisms and one that has this more explicit understanding. And I think there are really interesting dynamics to that more explicit understanding. If you look at information versus rule-based learning, button switch will totally mess up your information integration, doesn't pose a problem for rule-based learning, right? You're like, oh, you switch the buttons and then you switch your responding and it's not a problem anymore. I think really understanding the phenomenology of that and how that relates to different levels of cognitive processing is going to be the key to figuring out what processes AI is using when they're learning stuff, right? Is it always information integration? Is it always this sort of slow, high training, implicit process? Or can we come up with AI models that make these much more qualitative shifts with like insight moments and explicit representations?
I think it's a wonderful note to end on, and I hate to cut this discussion short, but we are at time. Thank you all so much, Alex, Jacob, Robert, Elaine, for your opening statements and being so responsive to our questions throughout. Please join us next Wednesday on site if you'll be in Sydney at CogSci. Looking forward to continuing this discussion soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all for coming. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.